the best you can do is, well, let's say castrate yourself. How would that be? And that would be real comical, except that it's also happening.
I see a backlash against masculinity and a sense that there's something toxic about
but
masculinity.
What is this idea of being over? Why is society overly feminized?
Well, I didn't ever say that society was overly feminized. I believe that there's a danger in our society at the moment of making the assumption that our culture, for example, is a tyrannical patriarchy, which it is in some small part, and that any active engagement on the part of young men in particular is indistinguishable from an unacceptable power and dominance drive, which I don't believe.
If much of the power and authority over a very long historical period has lain with men, isn't it only inevitable that some men will get a little hacked off when women are given a stab at something approaching equality?
Well, that could be inevitable, but that doesn't make it right, and it's certainly not something that I support.
So you think men's resentment is more important than women's effort to attain equality?
I'm not in favor of resentment at all. I think that if you're resentful, something's definitely wrong. Either you need to grow the hell up and take stock of your life, or you have some things to say to people that you haven't been saying.
You say science undoubtedly shows us that men and women have different traits, and there's a lot of science to back you up on that. But you say that because of that, men are hardwired to achieve success and to be successful in a way that women are not.
No, not at all. I've never said anything like that. I've said that there are biological differences between men and women that express themselves in temperament and in occupational choice, and that any attempt to enforce equality of outcome is unwarranted and ill-advised as a consequence.
How men can be men. Why do you think there is such a crisis of masculinity in the first place, and why are there so many people out there who are angry at you for even talking to men?
I think you could think about it as a consequence, in some sense, of the lack of a concept of original sin, oddly enough. People bear an existential burden, you know. It's an intrinsic part of life to feel guilty in relationship to nature and to feel guilty in relationship to culture. It's difficult for us to live in harmony with the natural world, and none of us are all we could be on the social front, and we have that sense intrinsically, you know, that there's a lack in us that needs to be redressed, and unfortunately that can be weaponized. And has been. And what I see happening to young men in particular, boys as well, not just young men, and maybe even starting at the age of toddlers, is that we have this sense in the world that human beings live in antagonism to nature and that we're actually a malevolent force. And that our social structures, which are clearly capable of the commission of atrocity, are fundamentally oppressive, patriarchal in their nature. And so then if you're a male in a society with that ethos, the motive force that drives you into the world to live is associated with rapaciousness and despoilation on the natural front, and then oppression and atrocity on the social front. It's like, well then, if you're the least bit conscientious, because this sort of accusation hurts conscientious young men the most, then the best you can do is, well, let's say castrate yourself. How would that be? And that would be real comical, except that it's also happening. So I guess that's why I think there's a crisis.
There is this idea that every form of masculinity is toxic, and you've spent your life trying to talk to men and say, no, you can channel that masculinity in not only a good way, but a necessary and productive and useful way. And people have gotten angry at you for this. Where do you think that's coming from? Why? That's obviously a good thing that you're doing. Why are so many people upset with you for that?
Well, the thing is, I never really set out to talk to men specifically, but I did set out, at least in part, to make a case for the utility of both the feminine and the masculine spirit. And it turned out that making the case for the masculine spirit was something that was more demanded by the culture, let's say. The anger, that's a complicated issue. There's a very large number of women, just like there's a very large number of men who have never had a real word of encouragement in their whole life. It's a really sad thing to see. It's a really, really sad thing to see that deeply and to have seen that reflected in so many thousands of people. But there are many women who've never had a positive relationship with anyone male in their life. We know, for example, that younger women are more likely to be attracted to men who show dark triad traits, narcissistic, Machiavellian, and psychopathic. And people who have those traits are characterized by the mimicry of competence. And so what women want in men more than anything else is competent generosity, and the data on that are very clear. But you can mimic that if you're narcissistic, and if you're a young woman, you can be deluded by that. It's partly because it points to the problem of dissociating competent confidence from the expression of power, per se. So we could call power, I'll define that as the willingness and ability to use compulsion to attain your aims. Now, if you are someone who has a proclivity to manifest power, then that looks like the manifestation of both ambition and will. And if you haven't had a positive relationship with anyone masculine in your life, and maybe with not even with your own internal masculinity, say, you can't discriminate between power and the ambition that serves competence. And so because that's terrifying, because the power, if you had only negative relationships with men, their capability to use power becomes such a threat that it has to be opposed at all costs, even if it manifests itself within the developmental pathway of your own son. So some of that's familial breakdown, and then you have a multi-generational pattern of that, and that makes it even worse.